Welcome, everyone. My name is Leslie Orloff. I run the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project at American University Washington College of Law. We are co-hosting this with the National Judicial Network and the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And thank you for all joining us today. And at the end of the webinar, I'll provide you a little bit more information about the National Judicial Network. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Judge Riggs.
Hi, my name is Vicarious. I'm currently for one more day, the judge in residence, the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And I'm so appreciative of the National Judicial Network, Leslie and NIWAP, and also to Dr. Carlson to address this extremely important topic. So at this point, Leslie, do you want to talk a little bit about maybe the grant that this comes under, and then maybe have a little bit of a discussion?
Yes. So change in the next slide. This event is being supported by the Office on Violence Against Women and the State Justice Institute, The opinions you'll be hearing today are ours, the presenters, and don't reflect positions of the Department of Justice or either of them.
So this issue of trauma is so important. And I'm going to talk from a judge's perspective, although I did spend 15 years as a deputy state public defender for the state of Colorado. I was a district judge in Colorado for 15 years, general jurisdiction judge, also spent 15 years as a public defender. So what we are talking about, this topic is so important, at least, from the judicial perspective, but I think this is just from a human perspective on anybody who handles issues related to domestic violence, child abuse, human trafficking. For us to have an awareness of the challenges that we face, which are intrinsic to the work that we do. The work that we do has many different effects. They have both a subtle effect and I would say a gross effect. I think that the gross effect that we can see as, maybe we're trembling or we're feeling that stressed out, but the subtle effects on our psyches are so important to recognize, and we've been doing a better job of recognizing what we're talking about. When I went to law school, we never talked about wellness for lawyers, and now there's actually courses that are being taught in many law schools emphasizing that. But we all provide such an awesome service to the communities that we are blessed to work with. But part of that, it comes an awesome responsibility that we are in a position, both physically, emotionally, psychologically, even spiritually, developing a deep connection with our hearts to provide these services with a level of awareness and with a level of wisdom that the people who we encounter on a daily basis deserve. One of the issues that comes out of not recognizing the effects of the work is that we have a tendency to go by, business as usual, the way we've always done things. And by focusing on what we're going to be talking about, not only the issue of vicarious secondary trauma, but also tools and strategies. Because I think we all have a recognition, more so now than years back, of the effects that the work has. But then the question becomes, well, what do I do? And we'll be providing some of those strategies. So this is so important, so dear to my heart, because I wish we would have these conversations when I was a lawyer and when I was a judge. And once again, Leslie, like I said before, I appreciate you providing this forum today and to have these discussions. So from a lawyer's perspective, how do you feel about what we're talking about?
Well, first of all, let me say for the judges and court staff on the call, I want to encourage you to join us. This is an event planned by the National Judicial Network. We have peer-to-peer sessions, and we also have national webinars like these, and we'll be sending all of you more information about that to share with your judges that you work with. And as a lawyer, I too, Judge Reyes, had a similar experience. I mean, I started practicing law representing exclusively immigrant victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse in the 80s. When, at that time, I was handling, I think I've litigated 800 cases, contested cases, not counting the ones I settled, and had no idea. Nobody was even talking about the impact that kind of a caseload might have on me or, the students I worked with or any of us. And when you're working, I mean, this is something being sponsored by NewApp, and we also focus on immigrant survivors. And that what we find is with immigrant survivors, they suffer the same kinds of harms from trauma as anyone else, but then there's this whole immigration experience laid on top of it. And so they have all the survivors I work with have complex trauma histories. They might have suffered trauma in their home country. They might have suffered additional trauma getting to the United States and whatever process led them here. And then there are high levels at which immigrants and limited English proficient victims are often targeted by perpetrators. And we see high rates of domestic violence and child abuse and sexual assault against immigrants, and particularly recent immigrants, and they become victims targeted for trafficking. And so what I'm very excited about by this opportunity and the rich materials that Dr. Carlson and Judge Reyes are sharing as part of this webinar that are also on the webpage I shared, and I'll post that again when I'm done talking, is that, what I never understood back in the day is how important kind of managing my own responses to my clients' trauma was for my ability to keep hearing the stories and being present for them and doing a good job in supporting them, and not preventing myself from being able to hear their full story. So as a lawyer, many of us say, okay, I've got physical violence, so I'm not going to ask about sexual assault, or I'm not going to ask about the details of stalking. And to some extent, that for me, that was a way of protecting myself back in the day, but it's not the right thing to do. And it's we can't do as good a job for the immigrant survivors we work with when we can't be present to hear their whole stories in a way and have the tools we need to be able to do it for them at our best so that we can be our best for them. And I think that's what this training is all about and why I'm so excited we're getting it now. I too wish I had it back in the 80s when I started practicing. But I am very happy to be able to be part of presenting it to you now. And I really think it'll make a huge difference whether you're a judge or a victim advocate working in the police department, or a lawyer, or a therapist or a social worker. For all of you who encounter immigrant victims, immigrant children, and crime victims generally, domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, stalking, child abuse, human trafficking, all of the kinds of things you're going to hear today will be beneficial to you in your work with those populations. Back to you, Judge Reyes.
Thank you, Leslie. And to help guide us and inform us is Dr. Marie Carlson. She is a clinical psychologist and clinical director of the Center for Survivors of Torture, which is located both in Austin and Dallas, Texas. One thing that Dr. Carlson and I do share is the same teacher. And so many of what we're going to learn today, I've actually been able to work into my life, and it works. So I guess that's why I wanted to take a moment and share that. So Dr. Carlson.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here today. So I wanted to just start by giving an overview of what I'll be presenting on today. And I'm going to begin by first talking about how vicarious traumatization and the ways that it can manifest among service providers. And then after that, I'm going to talk about the role of the nervous system in the manifestation as well as the mitigation of vicarious trauma symptoms. And then I want to leave the bulk of our time today to talk about some of the tools and strategies to increase well-being and help strengthen our resilience. So the big question is, how can routine exposure to indirect trauma impact providers? So, and by indirect trauma, what I mean are experiences of traumatic events that might not have happened directly to us, but that we're coming into contact in the context of, for example, the workplace, where we're working with someone on affidavit, or we're interacting with somebody who's experienced trauma maybe back in their home country. So the place that I work at, we work with a lot of asylum seekers, refugees, survivors of trafficking. So we're coming into a lot of contact, as all of you are as well, with these incidents of indirect trauma exposure. And there's been a lot of terms that that describe the physical and emotional impacts of secondary or indirect trauma. And today I'm going to use the term vicarious traumatization. And when I use that term, what I'm referring to are the traumatic responses that we can experience due to the exposure to the suffering of others or the graphic details of their experience. And I'm briefly going to touch on 3 forms of how vicarious traumatization can manifest, although these are not the only forms in which vicarious traumatization can manifest, but these are some of the bigger ones. So the first is empathic distress fatigue. Then I'm going to talk briefly about post-traumatic stress disorder and secondary traumatic stress. So empathy refers to our general capacity to resonate with others' emotional states. And that's, kind of whether positive or negative. And we have these 2 distinguishable pathways. One is an affective empathy system, and the other is a cognitive-based empathy system. And these 2 systems are distinguishable by they have separate neurobiological substrates. So the 2 brain images on the left-hand side of the slide, these orange areas are the areas that are activated in association with our affective empathy system. And this includes areas of the premotor and somatosensory cortical activity. And this includes areas where we perceive pain perception. And then on the other, on the right-hand side of the slide, you see the 2 brain images with the purple areas. And these are the neurobiological substrates associated with the cognitive empathy system. And this includes the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, the medial orbital frontal cortex, and the nucleus accumbens, sort of one of the reward areas of the brain. And with the area that's particularly relevant for today's talk is this affective empathy system, which is characterized by a self-oriented emotional response to a person's suffering. So this is like walking in another person's shoes or feeling the same feeling state that they are. And when we're in professions where we're coming into a lot of contact with indirect trauma, this can be a really emotionally and physically taxing type of emotional response to others' suffering. So what it contributes to, which I think is what Leslie really nicely described in the beginning here, is this desire to actually, over time, begin to withdraw from the situation and disconnect from the suffering individual in order to reduce your own personal distress. And this is an adaptive response. This is a protective and adaptive response, but it's not a helpful response when we're in the context of a work environment where part of our job is to be interacting with individuals who have experienced a lot of trauma in their backgrounds. And with this affective empathy system, you also see that just this self-other distinction really gets blurred. And then in contrast with this cognitive empathy system, this is a more other-oriented emotional response to another person's suffering. So rather than walking in a person's shoes, you're really walking beside that other person. And when you're walking beside another person, rather than in their shoes, it actually becomes much easier to attend to their stories and to help them. And so it's also associated with an altruistic motivation, to see the suffering of others relieved. And we have the resources, more resources with this cognitive, when we're using our cognitive empathy system, because we haven't had that sort of that overactivation or dysregulation of our alarm response or our sympathetic nervous system, which can be characterized by if we're overly using this affective empathy pathway, which I'll get into further as we go today. So empathic distress fatigue, this can be caused by prolonged or chronic exposure to the suffering of others. And some of the signs and symptoms include feeling numb or disconnected, isolating from others, just having a lack of energy, feeling very overwhelmed, powerless or hopeless, fatigue, having difficulty concentrating, and headaches as well. And from a neuroscientific standpoint, compassion fatigue is actually more accurately labeled empathic distress fatigue. And this becomes an important point because, as I'll discuss more later on, one of the empirically supported sort of strategies to help reduce empathic distress fatigue or combat it is to cultivate or strengthen our compassion.
Right. And if I can just interject really quickly,
Yeah.
Dr. Carlson, in looking at research related to leadership qualities, compassionate leadership, what they do talk about a lot is the fact that we're going to have empathy, but we move beyond empathy when we take action, whatever the action may be. And so that's why I really like this point that you're making, because we've been stuck for years in this idea of compassion fatigue, but you can't have enough compassion if you have an understanding of what compassion is. Is that correct?
Right, yes, absolutely. So yeah, we want to build our compassion, strengthen our compassion. And we'll do an activity a little bit later that's one example of one concrete tool for how to help strengthen and build compassion. Okay, and then we have post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is a trauma and stressor-related disorder that's defined by the development of characteristic symptoms following exposure to a traumatic event. And now with the DSM-5, the most recent version, which was in 2013, they added repeated or extreme indirect exposures to trauma that could now qualify as a qualifying traumatic event. But in addition to exposure to a traumatic event or indirect exposure, there's also these 4 symptom clusters that people with PTSD will express symptoms from. So the first one is this re-experiencing cluster, and this includes things like flashbacks or nightmares, as well as intrusive trauma-related thoughts or memories. And then there's the avoidance cluster, and this refers to avoiding thoughts or images, people, places, memories, anything that triggers reminders of the traumatic event or exposure. And then the negative alterations in mood and cognition. This symptom cluster includes things like diminished interest in activities, feeling detached from others, persistent negative emotional states, and really just this difficulty experiencing positive emotions. And then finally, there's the symptom cluster characterized by alterations in arousal. And this includes things like having difficulty sleeping, having troubles concentrating, having an exaggerated startle response. So if someone walks up behind you unexpectedly, jumping, or if there's an unexpected noise in your environment, having just an exaggerated startle to that. It can also include things like feeling on guard, scanning the environment for potential threat, as well as aggressive and sometimes reckless and self-destructive behaviors. Okay, and then we have secondary traumatic stress. And this is really similar to PTSD, but it's induced only by secondary, indirect, rather than primary or direct exposure to trauma. And this is basically just a definition-based distinction. So it can also be distinct from PTSD in that the secondary trauma can include mild or subclinical symptoms. And really, this definition is still debated a bit in the literature, and we won't really get too much into the details, but these are just some of the manifestations of vicarious traumatization or vicarious trauma symptoms. So all of these manifestations of vicarious traumatization or vicarious trauma symptoms share a commonality of a dysregulation at the level of the nervous system. And so what I mean by this is the mobilization of our stress response, of our sympathetic nervous system, gets activated, and it continues well after the threatening event has passed, or it activates in the absence of a threatening event, but it's kind of triggered by a false alarm. And before I get too further into the dysregulation, I first just want to provide an overview of our nervous system's response to perceived threat. So when we perceive a threat, our brain activates our natural alarm system. And this is a protective action in the face of true danger. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see that when a threat is perceived, the amygdala, which is the fear center of our brain, will send a signal to the hypothalamus, which is right at the top of our brainstem, which then sends a signal to our pituitary gland. And this in turn sends a signal through our autonomic nervous system to the adrenal glands, which sit right above our kidneys, and it activates our sympathetic nervous system. And then we have stress hormones, which are secreted by the adrenal glands, enter the bloodstream, and they activate a cascade of effects within the behavioral, cognitive, and physical systems. So the unpleasant sensations of this alarm response really motivate behavioral action tendencies, which refer to, or which are more widely known as kind of this fight or flight or freeze response. So panic is our body's natural alarm response when it perceives imminent or immediate threat. And the behavioral action tendency that's associated with panic is escape-oriented. So we want to fight off the threat. If that's not possible, the next thing we want to do is try to flee or run away from the threat. And if neither of those are possible, then we have a freeze response, which is a dissociative or a numbing. It's kind of a cognitive escape when when fight or flight is not viable. So with our cognitive system, what we see are these shifts in attention and orienting response. And this promotes the vigilance and scanning of our environment for any potential signs of threat. And so this really narrows our field of consciousness in response to anything in our environment that we perceive might resemble threat. And then we also form these protective cognitions or core beliefs about the safety from threat that's informed from our prior experiences. So the more experience we've had to trauma, the more trauma-related exposures, the more developed these core threat-related cognitions tend to be. And they tend to take reliable forms, particularly in relation to beliefs about safety and beliefs about trust. So examples related to safety include things like the world is a dangerous place. You never know when something terrible will happen to you. You have to be on guard, or I have to be on guard all of the time. And then some of the common cognitions about trust take forms such as, I can't trust anybody. People are not what they seem. You never know who will hurt you. And these changes in core beliefs can reinforce this kind of recurring traumatic stress reactivity, this alarm response, because of their role in perpetuating exaggerated perceptions of imminent threat well after the original threatening event or danger period has actually passed. Okay, and then we have the physical system, and this includes nervous and chemical effects, cardiovascular effects, and respiratory effects modulated by the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So in preparation for fighting off or fleeing from threat, the blood from the digestive system is diverted to large muscle groups. Our heart rate will increase and our blood pressure will also increase. And this facilitates the release of adrenaline throughout the body, and it increases our oxygen supply to large muscles. Again, this is going to help us fight or escape from danger. We also see that our blood vessels in the skin and intestines, as well as our extremities, are going to constrict. In part, this is a protective response, in the event of laceration to prevent us from bleeding to death. And we also have glucose that's secreted by the liver into the bloodstream. This helps to facilitate stamina. And then the release of analgesic chemicals, analgesic neurochemicals. So as we're fighting or trying to flee, if we're getting hurt in the process, we're not gonna, that's not gonna slow us down at the time, because we're not gonna be, we're gonna have a bit of a numbing response at that point. So we can keep up with the fighting or fleeing. Okay. So this is all, very protective, of course. Our alarm, the activation of our alarm system, there's nothing dangerous about it. It's protective. However, the activation in the absence of true danger, or these false alarms, as you can think of them, can be really disruptive to our daily lives, to our decision-making and overall well-being. And I think these two figures help to really demonstrate this. So on the left-hand side, you see that large swath of bluish, and that's our prefrontal cortex. And this is an area of the brain that's responsible for planning, inhibition of impulses, self-reflection, integrating information, and deliberative decision-making. And you see that under non-stress conditions, we're using this area of our brain all the time. When we're at work, this is a very important part of our brain to be using. On the right-hand side of the slide, you see the brain activation under highly stressful conditions, threatening conditions. And what you see here is this sort of almond-shaped oval in red, the amygdala. That's our fear center of the brain. And under conditions of threat, our amygdala overrides our prefrontal cortex activity. So our prefrontal cortex in this context is actually going offline, and it's kind of this bottom-up control of our brain activity. And as you can see, I should say, it's not that one is good or one is bad. It's context dependent. So when you're in true danger, you want your brain activation to be looking like this right side of the slide, because you want to be reacting. You don't have time to make a deliberative decision on whether or not you're in danger. You don't have time to kind of reason through a situation. You need to react immediately. And so this, saves our lives in the context of danger. The problem, of course, comes when we're at work, and if we're getting triggered by maybe triggered by some of the trauma that one of our clients has been through, maybe some of the violence that they've suffered, we don't want to be sort of responding, in this area of the, kind of the fight or flight response, because we're not able to use our, deliberative decision making. We're not able to use our self-reflection skills, our planning, and really integrating information to be using good judgment.
And Dr. Carlson, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Now, many people are drawn to the work that we do, and I can imagine people in your office are drawn to the work that they do because of their own personal experiences. So when we look at that, is there any studies as to different responses people have based on resilience and things like that help you do the work?
Well, I've heard of some research that has found, people who have, and this, I can't remember if it's particularly refugee backgrounds, survivors of torture, but in the context of like a helping professions such as counseling, having a history of trauma oneself can result in decreased ability to help others if they have not been gone through therapy or treatment themselves. But among those who have gone through treatment or therapy themselves, then the results show they actually do a better job or superior job of helping others than people that maybe haven't gone through, had trauma themselves. So the key really is addressing that trauma, finding helpful ways to self-regulate so that it's not creeping in, in ways that people might not even be aware of when they're trying to help others.
And then I would imagine that it's all how we react is so different for every one of us. Like, for instance, using an abnormal sense of humor, you know, dealing with what we see, or even, you know, not eating enough or eating too much, just whatever, however our psyche is dealing with these things. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, no matter what, we're going to see people trying to do self-regulation strategies. You know, for some of those kind of those hyperarousal responses I was talking about when I was highlighting the PTSD, you know, that symptom cluster with the exaggerated startle, the hypervigilance, you know, people will, that's a pretty aversive state. And so people will try to use, you know, different strategies to regulate it. Alcohol is often a very common one, especially among Americans. You see it less among actually immigrant populations who are coming here, which is great. So at the Center for Survivors of Torture, we actually don't see a lot of alcohol problems, but that's very, very different from what, you know, what I've seen clinically, you know, working at the Veterans Association, so working, or the Veterans Administration. So working at the VA, or just like also in community mental health clinics here in the United States, the rates of PTSD and alcohol alcohol or substance abuse or dependence are about, you know, 80% overlap. So people will be trying strategies for self-regulation, and they might work in certain ways, but there can also sometimes be some drawbacks to some of the strategies that we might just try on our own. And so what we'll be talking about later are some of the strategies that we can use that help regulate the areas that we want to be regulated without having some of the side effects that things like regulation strategies that involve eating food, or that involve restricting food, or that involve alcohol or substance use, excessive, you know, substance use can have.
Thank you.
Okay, so, and yeah, again here, so the frequent and unregulated activation of our alarm system, these false alarms, you know, can become a form of chronic stress, which which we might know at this point that is related to, you know, an array of adverse outcomes, including chronic diseases, compromised immunity. So when the alarm system is dysregulated or overused due to frequent triggers in our environment, this can lead to a form of toxic stress termed high allostatic load. And if your allostatic load remains high for long enough, the body is going to eventually adapt, but we pay a high price for this adaptation. And so these adaptations are where we start to see these disease processes accelerate. So things like hypertension, cardiovascular disease, affective disorders like anxiety and depression, and impaired immune system. So now the big question is, well, what do we do? You know, short of leaving our jobs where we're exposed on a day-to-day basis to, to the suffering of others, to the, reading, the affidavits or listening to people's accounts of the torture or the trauma history that they have been through. What can we do to help protect ourselves or mitigate against, this vicarious traumatization and promote resilience? So I'm going to first start by giving an overview, and then we're going to go into some of the details and actually practice some of these strategies together. So I'd say the first step is to really recognize the signs and symptoms of vicarious trauma response. And that's kind of what we've just already done here today. Okay, and then these second steps I'm going to talk about, or second strategies, we're going to talk about in just a minute. So I'll expand on what each of these areas really means. So strengthening healthy self-regulation strategies is a very helpful tool or way to protect against vicarious traumatization and promote resilience. Also, the cultivation of empathic concern or compassion. Strengthening social supports, that's a really big one too. And then structural and organizational level policies that foster a secure work environment are also very important. Okay, so the first strategy that I want to talk about is strengthening healthy self-regulation strategies. And here it's really important to begin by prioritizing the foundation. By the foundation, what I mean are things like nutrition, exercise, hydration, and sleep. So once we really prioritize these areas, we're going to find that all of the tools that I'm going to be talking about subsequently are going to be easier to learn, easier to practice, and we're really going to get more benefit from them. So it's really, I can't emphasize enough how important really prioritizing nutrition, exercise, hydration, and sleep really is. No matter how busy we are, this is really important. And it's going to help make us, more productive in all realms of our life. And, oftentimes it's one thing to talk about, okay, start exercising, eating healthy, drinking water, and getting sleep. It's oftentimes easier said than done. So what can be helpful when you want to change a habit is starting by setting a goal. And there's, research shows that when you set goals in a certain type of way, you can be more successful than others. So if you set a goal that's very specific, that's measurable, that's achievable, so realistic, it's relevant to your target goal, and that's time bound, goals that are set with these characteristics, people tend to do better at achieving them. And these are called SMART goals. That's kind of the acronym. And in the resources section at the end, there'll be a link to a template that, if you're interested in learning a little bit more about this or setting some SMART goals for yourself, that might be a good resource to take a look at. And then another tool is self-monitoring. So even the very act of writing down, what you are doing in terms of exercise or in terms of glasses of water a day or hours of sleep a night, even the very act itself can help change the behavior. And sometimes this can be, due to noticing patterns that you might not previously have been aware of. So it's also a way to sort of help increase self-awareness of certain patterns. Another good tool that I like to share is bringing a water bottle. Bringing a water bottle to work, and this can really help with gauging your daily water intake. So if you get one of those large Nalgene bottles, any brand of large water bottle will be helpful because it kind of takes off some of that, the sort of cognitive burden of having to, count up 8 glasses of water, and you just have that by your desk, and you have to, maybe 2 in a day is your daily water intake. So it's easy to kind of at any point see where you are and how much you need to sort of catch up during the day to meet your daily water goal. And then learning sleep hygiene practices can also be really helpful. So this can be helpful specifically to promote regular quality sleep that's in accordance with your circadian rhythm. And at the end of in the resources section at the end, I should say, we also have a couple links, to the American Sleep Association that have some specific guidance on sleep hygiene practices that you can use to help improve your sleep quality. Okay, and now we have practicing, and the next strategy I want to talk about is practicing emotion regulation skills. And this one is really important, so I'm going to spend a few slides on it. And the first part of this is increasing self-awareness. So what I mean by this is practice noticing your current state of physiological activation. And some self-monitoring practices that can help to strengthen our self-awareness or our mindful awareness include the self-awareness scale, which I'll talk about what that means or what that looks like in a minute, and we'll practice with it together. And there's also other examples include body scan and progressive muscle relaxation. So today I'm not going to be showing examples of the body scan or progressive muscle relaxation, but in the resources section, there are links to audio guides for both of these. And in short, the body scan basically is you either start at the top of your body or at your head or maybe at your feet, and you go, progressively body part by body part. And you just notice any sensations that you feel. And you notice it without judgment and without trying to change anything. And with the progressive muscle relaxation, that's similar to the body scan in that you either start at the head or the feet and progressively, go down or up. And what you do is you go by muscle, clenching and then relaxing. And that really helps you sort of get that full range from tension to relaxation. And by practicing these, areas over time, what it does, it helps you sort of have a mindful awareness of what current state your body is in, and notice if you might need to, to implement some relaxation strategies, or just to even relax your muscles. So oftentimes we can clench certain muscles when we're tense or stressed, and it's become so much of a habit we don't even realize it. So these can be really helpful in just kind of bringing mindful awareness to your current state of how your body is feeling. Okay, so now we have this self-awareness scale that I just mentioned. And this is a tool that was developed by Logan and Tollison as part of their contemplative-based trauma and resiliency training. So what Judge Brace was talking about in the beginning in terms of our common mentor that we share. And this is a tool that's used to check in with your own level of physiological arousal in the moment. So the self-awareness scale helps you to improve your self-regulation, and we use it to check in with ourselves and identify when we need to self-regulate, when we need to self-regulate our nervous system. And we can use this just throughout the day when we're at work. So there's times where we can both feel too little arousal in our system, as well as feeling too much. And again, this scale presents us with a quick way to check in with ourselves and to reset, using some of the skills we're going to talk about next, like breath work and grounding. So the scale, as you can see here, it goes from 1 to 10. 1 is where is associated with low arousal, so you may be feeling a little bit numb or a little shut down. 2 to 3, this is really the kind of the ideal range that we want to be in. So here you're feeling calm, your nervous system is relaxed, your breathing is easy, your heart rate is slow. And then there's the 4 to 5. So this is checking in with mild to moderate arousal. Your breathing or heart rate might be quickening a little bit. You might feel slight emotional discomfort, maybe a little bit of agitation. And then it goes up. So the 6 to 8, you're going to be feeling, you might be noticing your heart rate increasing even more. The breathing might be becoming more shallow or quicker. Some people might be sweating at this point, maybe feeling agitated or quite anxious. And then there's the 9 to 10 range. So this is kind of consistent with the level of a panic episode. Your heart might be racing. You might be hyperventilating, just breathing very heavily, very shallow. And you might be breaking out in a cold sweat at this point, feeling extreme agitation or extreme emotional distress. So as you practice identifying your own levels of physiological activation, you're going to become better positioned at being able to step in and self-regulate your level of physiological arousal or activation. And some of the tools that you can use to do this in the moment or sort of on demand are breath work, grounding strategies, and a sanctuary or safe place, which is a guided imagery strategy. So for the breath work and grounding strategies, we're gonna actually do an example of these together. I'm gonna walk you through it. So before we begin this activity, let's use that self-awareness scale to rate our current level of calm on that 1 to 10 scale. So I'll flip back so you can look at that scale again. So I encourage you to identify where you fall on the scale and maybe write it down if you have a piece of paper nearby. Okay, so we're going to begin by doing a 1 to 2 minute breath activity, followed by a grounding activity. So let's begin by taking 3 deep cleansing breaths. You can close your eyes or allow them to remain open. Notice which is more comfortable for you. Even if your eyes are closed, soften your gaze. Now breathe in through the nose Then gently release a long, slow exhale. With each breath, allow the exhale to be slightly longer than the inhale. To establish the feeling, count slowly to 5 on the in-breath and to 7 on the out-breath. Lengthening the exhale strengthens our calm. What sensations do you notice now in your body? What has changed? Do you feel calmer, more present? Now I want you to gently bring your body's contact with your feet and your seat. Notice how the chair supports your back. Notice how the chair supports your sit bones. Notice how the chair supports your upper thighs. Enjoy the support. Bring your attention to your feet directly under your knees. Feel your heels, the balls of your feet, your toes. Make firm contact with the ground. As your mind begins to wander, gently bring your attention back again to the in-breath, the out-breath, and to the feeling of contact with your feet and your seat. Imagine breathing in from the ground, something you need in this moment. Peace, ease, quiet, self-compassion. What do you need at this moment? Now exhale into the ground, something you need to release. Fear, distress, tension, anxiety, feelings of terror or rage. What do you need to release through your body at this moment? As you bring mindful awareness to your sensory experience, it supports stabilization, a sense of being rooted, grounded, and calm. Feel your sit bones in a similar way. First the left, the right, then balancing your weight equally on both sit bones. Notice how your spine lengthens naturally and gently upwards from the balance of your sit bones. Allow your attention to settle. As you shift your awareness between your seat, your feet, the firm contact with the ground, and your breath, you're developing important somatic anchors for your calm. Now you may gently open your eyes if you had them closed, and you can return your attention to the room. And now I want you to rate your current level of calm using the same self-awareness scale.
And Dr. Carlson, while people are doing that, and we only have, it's amazing. I think we go to do 2 hours with these practices, but I think it's very important. It was very important for me to realize that these practices that you just walked us through, and these other ones that you're going to go through, we don't do them when we're in the middle of chaos, right? We want to develop a practice so that when we do come into challenging times, we can actually be in a better position to deal with whatever's going on.
Yes, yes, exactly. And so I'd recommend, and this is something I've certainly practiced myself, is using this SAS scale, bringing it with you to work, and during the day, just pick 6 times. What I did is pick 6 times throughout the day that I'm going to check in with my own level of physiological activation, rate it on the SAS scale, so I get practiced at recognizing it, even at times when I might not notice I'm activated. Because in the beginning, the challenge is noticing when we're activated, because sometimes that's hard to, that in itself is a skill to build. So having certain times in the day where I was going to check it, that helps to be able to check in and take inventory on what level you're at. And then over time, it can become more automatic. So I'm using this SAS scale, almost every day to a certain extent. And when I'm outside of that 2 to 3 range, then I'll use, especially that breathing technique, is that I'll use to bring my nervous system back into that 2 to 3 range. And so when I'm, in the context of maybe sitting with a client who's sharing their torture history with me, sitting with someone who's seeking asylum, from experiencing, torture related to, persecution from, based on their political beliefs, for example, I'm able to use these breathing strategies kind of, in real time to help regulate myself so that I can still be of assistance in spite of the, the information that they're sharing about their, about their trauma experience.
And I did this on the bench, and nobody knows that you're doing
right. Yeah,
it.
nobody, exactly. Yeah. And this is something that I also, share with clients too, and the great part is it is portable. So you can bring it with you anytime, you can use it anytime, and absolutely nobody notices. So there's, in addition to the kind of on-demand strategies, which I just talked about, the grounding and the breath work, there's also some strategies that you can practice, and they might take a little bit longer up front, but they also help with this overall self-regulation of your nervous system. And those include things like meditation, yoga, and expressive writing. And with this expressive writing and reflective writing, there's actually a guide that was developed. So journaling is certainly, generally can be quite helpful, but this gives even a little bit more than that in terms of some of the specifics you can use. So if there's, an event after you come home from work and you're noticing that, something that somebody had shared with you during that day has really stuck with you, or maybe an image has just really stayed in your mind, keeps intruding on your thoughts. What you can do is you can do this, use this reflective writing guide to help sort of process that experience. And so this, there's a couple elements to this writing that makes it helpful. So what you want to do is in your writing, you first want to recall some of the emotional aspects of what you were feeling during that experience. So recalling the feelings that you had, the emotions that you had, whether it was fear, disgust, terror. So just writing down the emotions that you experienced. Then you want to also write down any physical sensations that you recall during the experience. So maybe you were holding your breath. Maybe you noticed tingling or dizziness. So writing down any of the physical sensations that you remember during that experience. Then you want to write about some of the, recall anything that you were thinking during that time. What was going through your mind? What were some of the thoughts going through your mind during that experience? And then after you write down the emotional, physical, and cognitive components, you want to kind of make a summary of the full experience and overall. And we were going to do this as a group, but I think today maybe, or right now in the interest of time, maybe Judge Race, you and I can go over this one verbally, if that's okay. Okay. So if you could think of an experience that you had with a client or a situation where you experienced secondhand exposure to a person's trauma. And then maybe you can share with us just briefly what that is.
Witnesses testifying in a horrible sexual abuse situation. Okay.
So what emotions, so when you were hearing them testify, what emotions were you experiencing at that time?
Frustration, anger at times, fear, empathy, an overwhelming amount of emotions we don't have enough time to fit them all in.
Okay, sure. Yeah, and when you're writing down, really I encourage you to, you'll be able to have the time to write them all down and really make an exhaustive list of all of those emotions, because oftentimes it really can span the gamut. But what physical sensations do you recall during that experience? What did you feel in your body?
I felt an incredible heaviness on my heart. I was also using the wood underneath the bench to squeeze, to let off the stress, and it formed a line, a cut in my hand that I still have a scar from.
Oh.
So
yeah, it's powerful. What thoughts do you recall? What was going through your mind during that experience?
This could be my child, that this person went through was no human being should go through. What is the jury thinking? What am I doing? I mean, there's the emotional inside, and then all of a sudden trying to take care of the business on the outside. Right.
Yeah. So you don't get to fully process it at the time, then it can easily stick with you. And so now if you were going to try to put it all together, thinking about the emotional, components, what you were feeling, the sensations in your body, the thoughts going through your mind, how would you kind of summarize the full experience?
Just an incredible amount of frustration, but never was able to release in a sense of relief. Okay. I never got a finality on the emotions. They just kept on bundling up. Yeah. And that's why it's helpful to be able to take the time and the space to, reflect on this event and be able to write down, all of the emotions that you're feeling, all of the feelings, and really put it all on paper. You can always, delete it or tear it up once you're done, but just sometimes getting it out of your mind, putting it onto paper can be really helpful, a helpful way for your brain to fully process the event. And when you, so go ahead. Oh, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, and when you do this activity, try your best just to keep your pen to your paper and keep writing. Don't worry about, perfect sentences or syntax or spelling. You just really want to be, processing the event.
And you have a listing of tools that are in the PowerPoint. I know we're at our time, right, Leslie? But one of the things that I think it's important because of some of the comments is that we don't just turn these tools and deal with them with our clients. We need to actually integrate these practices and be taught by teachers before we share these with others.
Yes. That certainly can be helpful.
Because people can be re-traumatized with some of the things that we're talking about. Right. It's helpful,
definitely to get, to do your homework and to get the right, type of training to fully understand it before you can implement some of these practices.
Leslie, I'm going to let you go ahead, and I'm going to put in the chat my new email. So if anybody has any questions, any comments, we've got a lot of resources. Leslie, thank you once again, and my God, the audience, thank you for the work that you do and taking some time to learn strategies or have a realization and awareness of what's happening to you to better not only serve the people that we spend time with, but also ourselves. And Leslie, you're muted. So,
I want to thank the National Council for hosting us. I want to thank interpreters for interpreting it, Dr. Carlson for your great work on this webinar, Judge Reyes for your leadership in putting it together. And to let you know, the materials are available for those of you that are judges or work with judges. I highly recommend membership in the National Judicial Network. It's free, and it's a point at which judges can learn from each other, much like we're learning from Judge Reyes today. So I invite you to join us. And then we will be sending out the information following the webinar, and you can call us for questions and technical assistance. Thank you again so much. This was so helpful. I really appreciate everybody's time today.
thank you.
Mary Kate, do we want to hang on a minute or so afterwards?
Yeah. To the interpreters, we thank you so much. You're good to go.
Whew. You know, I didn't think it was gonna be that. Wow. Walking through what I just walked through, I shouldn't have gone to the most extreme. I should have just stayed with, somebody stole a candy bar and
No, but for this audience, I think that was a good choice.
Just some of the audience is still here. People are still leaving.
Oh, sorry.
Probably about 200 people still in here.
Okay.
but I mean, I just can't tell you how much I appreciate everybody. The audience, Mary Kate, Dr. Carlson, and Leslie. I mean, this is what people need on a regular basis. It's what got me through things.
And Dr. Carlson, I just want to be sure to follow up with you, because I think there were some resources on body scans, progressive muscle relaxation, and expressive writing that I was not, I was looking for them in the materials, and I just want to be sure I have the right links and I can just highlight those in the materials. So if they're missing, we can add them, not a problem.
Yes, I believe they're included in, I think I had some links to the UCSD Center for Mindfulness and UMass or MassGen. And then there was, I think
I saw those. So I'll just, maybe you could help me figure out, or just send me an email as which ones lead to these things.
Oh,
Or
okay,
if
sure.
there's particular links to the body scan and the progressive muscle relaxation and the expressive writing guide
Okay.
that I could add directly so that people know where to find those.
Oh, okay, sure.
And there's, I mean, one of the organizations was Cultivating Emotional Balance. Dr. Eve Ekman runs that, and I went through that course too. And that was just amazing as far as recognizing emotions. I use that regularly. Actually, that's what we're working on right now. We're spending, I don't like the word working, but sharing our experiences in my DV group in the prison. We're having those conversations. We're bringing up things not as drastic, and then working through emotions and looking at the preconditioning, who am I as a human being when this emotion came up? So that's another great, like an hour of just dealing with emotional balancing. A couple of the comments, Dr. Carlson, were, and I did put in there somewhere, we may be able to add resources and
We can, we definitely can do that. I just need to get them, and then I can.
So there was this one, and there's also saying, hey, can anybody ever do breath work with their clients? That's why I made the comment, hey, you need to know what you're doing before you start putting clients through this. And that's very important, because I needed to realize that too. But one of the comments was, how, like inappropriate laughter, sensitive humor, are there studies or an explanation on why that happens? And then there was a question about strategies or tools specific to neurodivergent individuals. And then there was also a comment about linked fate. This concept of linked fate. And when I looked it up, it looked like it had to do with people are like, as a group, experiencing things. It may not be, I'm just quickly Google searching things.
Okay, maybe like collective trauma.
Yeah, it was the word was linked fate. And
Okay,
it was a concept like that, but it just, yeah, it seems that it was a collective response.
okay.
Linked-
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that term either. I'd have to look it up to be able to speak to it. But yeah, I have to look that one up. But in terms of the inappropriate laughter, I know that laughter is one way that helps our nervous system relax. So my thought is that sometimes inappropriate laughter in certain ways can be a defensive response. Again, maybe if we don't have other strategies that we're able to pull on to relax our nervous system, that inappropriate laughter might be in certain ways coming out as a way to help in that moment, decrease the activation of our nervous system. And in terms of resources for, or I guess, are you asking me these questions in terms of answers right now? Or are you wondering about me adding to the resources?
Yeah, these are just questions that came up that
Mhm.
I made copies of it and put in a document, and I can
Mhm.
email these to you, and if they
Okay.
make sense to you.
Sure.
Right, so
many
Dr.
great
Carlson,
questions in
we
there.
can address them in a variety of ways. If there's a resource you want to put, we can add it to the webpage, and we can just add it in a way that highlights what that resource is, that it's in response, so that somebody who asked this question can see, oh, there's the answer. Or I go
Okay.
look at this resource for the answer. If you, Judge Reyes, if you want to draft up like the questions, and then we want to do a Q&A, like to answer some of those. The issue is we have to decide what we want to answer publicly. And I don't know that you want to make things in writing, like whether that formality is really needed. Having done a lot of Q&As on substantive legal issues following large webinars, it can be very time intensive, and I'm not sure I don't know that we need it if we can provide resources. If we can make sure that the major questions that people are asking, that between watching this recording and the following the links to what's provided, they can find the resources they need or get connected, as you said, with programs that can provide them additional information and background and practices that would be useful.